known throughout the country. Thank you, Dee. Offshore wind as well as electric cars. And tonight he is going to talk about offshore wind and the potential for Delaware. So Willett, take it away.
Thank you, Jill. You'll have to give me permission to share screen in a few minutes. I'm really humbled by the group that you put together with your allies here, and I appreciate everyone's being willing to take a little time to hear what we have to say on this report. Some real distinguished people on the line, and I hope I'll make good use of your time here. The current status is that we have a draft report that's being reviewed by DNREC, but we're eager to release it, widely as soon as we can. We've also had peer review of it by a number of analysts of offshore wind. So that process is completing, and there'll be a little time where DNREC holds it, and then it gets released. So if there are any questions about that, you can address individually. But what I'm going to do is describe the process that we followed and the overall way that an offshore wind procurement works, and then give a qualitative comparison of some of the numbers that we're not releasing publicly for another couple of weeks or so. So that's just kind of introduction. I'm going to use visuals, and then have plenty of time for Q&A after that. So
Dee, did you do the screen? There you go.
Yeah, so it looks like that's showing. And anybody having trouble seeing the screen?
I can see it.
You may want to use your move the faces to the side. That will obscure occasionally. At least on mine, it's on the right there. Okay, so this is a study by 4 of us. We'll look at the authors in a sec. But the talk is I'm responsible for the talk, and my affiliations are there. Several affiliations at the University of Delaware. So I am doing this in my role as technical advisor to the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. Just so you know sort of what organization that is and kind of where we're coming from before you hear any content. We have a small number of people. It's really, sort of 3 or so kind of dedicated or paid, and then a large group of volunteers and stuff. So for a particular study, we will recruit experts and reviewers. We are generally, think it's important to have more renewable energy on the system, but we are not taking an advocacy position. So we provide factually based information. And it is reviewed prior to release. So that process is just winding down now. We are philanthropy funded. The executive director is Chris Olaf, and governed by a board of directors. I guess it's a board of advisors. We don't have any commercial interest. We're not funded by commercial entities, although sometimes specific reports or guidance may have commercial funding. It's identified as such. There's no commercial funding in this case. The reports like this we've done previously for New York and Massachusetts. They've always been requested by the state, and then the state has utilized those the reports afterwards. So I think we've done a useful job to previous state governments. And in this case, we did have a request from both DNREC and from the General Assembly, and I'll thank Stephanie Hansen, Senator Hansen, who's on the line, for her support of this in writing. So we felt like we could proceed with some understanding that there'd be a use of the material when we produced it. So that's the background on SIOW. So a little bit of a review for a few of you, but why are we looking at offshore wind? Why does offshore wind make sense to the eastern states that are contracting for it? It is now cost competitive with wholesale power. given that there is a federal investment tax credit right now. That's in the Northeast, generally speaking, sort of Virginia, all the way up the coast. That federal subsidy will go away at some point, but it is also decreasing in price, it seems, almost yearly. So I think we will probably go from cost competitive with the federal subsidy to cost competitive without, and then moving into the cheaper than most other power sources over the next decade. We'll see, I think, that transition. That's a prediction, not in the report, but just my personal prediction to understand what that means, cost competitive. The carbon dioxide and pollutants produced by offshore wind are quite small. They're not zero. There is environmental damage, and there is a little bit of CO2. We can quantify that now. So states that have an interest in CO2 reduction or improvement of health by air pollution reductions have done it in part for that reason. That's a motivation also. And the third is it's a really large resource. And I'll make a comparison, but for example, the state of Delaware could run entirely on renewable energy using offshore wind plus some solar and other things. So it's not sort of, we can get 10% with this. And what many of the Northeast states have concluded in formal documents and analysis, for example, New York, we can't get to our renewable energy goals, we can't get to our climate goals without offshore wind. We have other resources, but they're not nearly as big. So we have to have that as part of our mix. And, you know, for Delaware, relatively small state, one project, you know, is 25 to 35% of our power is taken off carbon and polluting resources. So it's a big piece, each project. And so why does that matter? Why not do it, you know, 5% every 10 years, which is good, you know, it's good to be doing that. But we really need to address climate change by things that are large. And I'm not here to advocate for dealing with climate change. Personally, that's very important to me, but that's not part of this analysis. But if you aren't doing things that have big chunks and are big resources, you can't deal with really eliminating carbon from the power sector. And if you can't eliminate it from the power sector, you can't eliminate it from the automotive sector and industrial sector. So that's why states in our region are doing offshore wind, this list. It's a big chunk at once, that's great, but that doesn't mean we can do 5 chunks this year because it's a sort of a 6-year, 7-year time period, which oddly is sort of 4 years of paperwork and then 2 years of construction. So that doesn't mean you have to wait until the whole first one is all done and then start on the second. You can stagger it, but it is a long process, and it's not a process that you can just do yourself. You know, you can call a solar installer yourself, and if you've got the money, you can get solar on your roof, and that's a good thing. But you can't do offshore wind by yourself. These projects are, you know, 2.5 billion and involve mobilizing, you know, 1,000+ people and so forth. And they generally cannot be done without involvement of the state government. States regulate electricity in the United States. So the state has to be involved, which means institutions and coalitions have to be involved, like this one. So then kind of is this, my screen is, let's see, let's just take a minute to adjust here. My screen is sort of putting our faces over the captions. I don't know if anyone else is having that problem, but you can shrink it with that little flat bar on the faces there. Okay, so this is National Renewable Energy Lab's take on why doing offshore wind. I just gave you my take, which is sort of Eastern states and state government oriented. This is National Renewable Energy Lab's take. It's generation that's close to load. So you see the blue in here? Well, there's a lot of blue in the middle of the country. That's a strong wind area, but it's not nearly as populated. The offshore wind blue, which is again high wind resource, is close to these coastal population centers, which are also in utility terms, load centers. And they're stronger winds. So the darker colors are stronger winds on this map because wind over the ocean, you know, as sailors know well, is generally stronger than the wind just a few kilometers away on land. You can do large scale projects. This is a part of this kind of large thing. You can make a big difference in carbon. You're not kind of running into the mountain or the end of the field or whatever. You've got very large areas you can build at once, which also reduces cost. I'm not sure what they mean by unique economic benefits, so I won't try to talk through that. And then there's a possibility of revitalizing ports and domestic manufacturing, because these parts are so big, you're generally making them in the region and then shipping them out from ports near the facility. And big wind turbines are lower cost. I mean, each one is higher cost, but per megawatt hour, per megawatt of capacity, they're lower cost. But you can't move the size of turbines that we use offshore on land. You are restricted by bridges and so forth. So that's another reason. So this is kind of NREL's take on why I do offshore wind. So I kind of just want to introduce that for starters. So, and then, from a Delaware perspective, this is the quantities behind the statement that we can't deal with climate change without looking at offshore wind. So just in terms of usage, this is a per megawatt average production or use. Our usage is at the top there: electricity, oil, and natural gas. Mostly, there's some nuclear in there in the electricity. We can't really get a large chunk of that displaced from other sources, whereas offshore wind is kind of maybe twice the amount needed for Delaware, all of Delaware's energy. There's kind of a bunch of assumptions and so forth behind this number, but this is approximately right, and this is what other states have been concluding. So just kind of quick on quantities for power and energy. Power is a flow. Energy is a reservoir, if you will. You've got a certain amount of energy in a battery. When that battery is running a flashlight or an electric car, there's a rate coming out of the battery. That's power. So I'll use kilowatts mostly. I'm going to mostly use power units. I'm not going to use energy units so much, but you pay for kilowatt hours on your bill. At any one moment, your house is using some number of kilowatts. And also talk about average power. So the average house, 1.5 kilowatts. If you think in terms of water as an analogy, which is a famous analogy used in teaching electrical engineering, a gallon is a quantity like energy. It's a reservoir, it's a certain amount, and then gallons per minute is the analogous rate for power. So quickly, one slide on units. You can ignore this if you want, but this will help you understand a little bit better. We're talking about power units. Watt is the basic power unit. 1 watt is what your iPhone produces or uses rather. Your house on average, like I said, 1.5 kilowatts. I'm using that subscripted A for average, because sometimes your house is using more, sometimes less. That's a detached single family dwelling, average in the US, 1.5 kilowatts. Turbine, an offshore turbine, is 10 to 15 megawatts. So kilowatt, megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So it's 10,000 of your average houses per turbine, which is pretty crazy. Delaware is 1.2 gigawatts, again, on average. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. So that's the average amount of load. And then how much do we need to power that? Well, if you just rough numbers here, think of wind as producing about 50% of its rated capacity. So on average, a 10 megawatt turbine produces 5 megawatts, sometimes more, sometimes less, on average 50%. So you would need 2.4 gigawatts of capacity of offshore turbines to power 100% of Delaware's electricity. So we're looking at commercial US projects are between 800 and 1,200 megawatts. So 3 800 megawatt projects is enough to run all of Delaware's electricity. We're not saying we're going to build that many or we're going to entirely run Delaware from wind, but just so you have an understanding of the scope and the scale here. So 800 megawatt project is kind of the smallest commercial project. 3 of those would run all of Delaware's electricity. So this is the report. We're, like I said, a few days away from finalizing, and my co-authors, Lily Peterson, Amy Bostiels, and Chris Olaf, the director of SIOW, All of us have some affiliation or another with the University of Delaware. So the kind of broad, approximate contents here, this is not from the table of contents, but what's the cost of, what's the price of offshore wind power in comparison to conventional power? It's a complicated comparison. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. And then, if looking at that, if state decision makers decide it's worth doing a procurement, how would the state create a procurement process? If you just sort of wait for a developer to come in and make an offer, you're not going to get a very good price. And it's going to be a difficult process for that developer to go through. So how does the state create a procurement process that provides maximum benefit to the state, minimum cost to the ratepayers, and make a process that enables the developer to provide a lower cost product and to have less risk? So then how do you construct, that is, how do agencies design and write an efficient request for proposals and then a bid evaluation? So those are really two key things. So there's a request for proposals, and then you get proposals in, and there's an evaluation of those bids, which I think we're probably going to want to have that mostly based on price, but not entirely. But that's, again, a state decision to make. And then in addition to that actual procurement process, there are actions the state can take to reduce electricity cost. And we've got 6 that we think are important. And the state will decide as part of this whole process, if they go ahead, which ones to follow and which ones to put more effort into. But we have quantified each of those. So we know for each of those actions, and some are pretty precise, others are approximate, how much each of those actions would reduce the cost of electricity. So we also have actions the state can take to increase employment or to create new businesses. So those are all options that the state can take. We submitted the draft of this to DNREC and reviewers on 7th February. Final report will be submitted this week to DNREC. Okay, so how do you do an offshore wind procurement? The long version is in the report. Here's the very short version. Offshore wind is different from most other sources of electric power, and not like there's something special we have to coddle about it, not different in that way, but it has different characteristics. So for the state to get the best deal and to enable a project to go forward, there needs to be an offshore wind specific solicitation. So Delaware some years ago with HB6 did a all sources solicitation, and actually an offshore wind project at that point won against other power sources. But that is really kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole. And the price was not that great at that point. So if we want to, and there are other reasons why the price was high, but if we want to do this so that it benefits the state, we want an offshore wind specific solicitation. And that's one of the things we'll just say as a recommendation. Other things we'll say, this is for the state to decide, here's the pros and cons. But that's the one I think we would just give as a recommendation. Of course, the state can take or leave our advice. And the kind of first principle here, you have to have competition. You have to have a request for proposal, and you got to make sure you're getting more than one proposal. That's going to be important to get a competitive price. I mean, that's kind of Econ 101, right? So the way the process works, the principal state issues a RFP. RFP has requirements. So there's some things you have to do or you haven't submitted a valid RFP. And then there's other things where you're told, the bidder, a developer, are told, well, if you do this, you're going to do better in our evaluation. There's not a cutoff, there's not necessarily a requirement, but there's a ranking. So there's requirements and there's ranking characteristics. And one I've mentioned is price. I would certainly expect that to be an important price ranking characteristic, but there may be others. And other states have had big weighting for example, employment. You only have some bidders who are qualified. You can't just be somebody with a good idea You have to have site control. That is, you've got an ocean lease from the Department of Interior, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We'll come back to them. And you have to have the capability to build a complex $2.5 billion project. That's evaluated in advance of the bidding. So you have to qualify to be a bidder. Again, we're describing the process other states have followed. We think it makes sense for Delaware to follow these things. They're kind of straightforward ways to do it, but maybe there'll be something else creative done. And the states, again, in the US, states manage electric utilities. The state gives the electric utilities a monopoly jurisdiction, and they regulate their prices and so forth. So in this case, also, the state would manage the process. And that will be through the Public Utility Commission, but also probably through law which sets some specific qualities of this process. But in the end, what's going to be the contractual relationship is that one or more utilities in Delaware will be signing a power purchase agreement from the producer. And I'm calling the producer at different times, the bidder, the entity with site control over an ocean space, the developer, the operator of the wind farm. So that may be the same company, or they may shift around as the process goes through. But it's the contract between that entity who's producing the electricity and the utility who's buying the electricity and distributing it to their buyers. That's ultimately the commercial relationship here, even though the state has pretty much determining control over how this whole process works. Now, this is renewable energy, but it's different. And we keep kind of running into, we didn't really understand things. But, I think that'll be discussions that we have in Delaware. But we're now looking at bid prices that are at or below market price for electricity. So, that means some things are different. You don't necessarily need any price support mechanisms. You don't necessarily need RECs, although I think it's probably a good idea to have the current RECs purchased by provided by the developer and purchased by the utility. But RECs are not necessary to make the project make sense. And there certainly isn't any need for the state to issue, subsidies or money or payments to the developer to make the project go. This is now more or less a market transaction. I just said the state has to have all kinds of involvement because they need to set the rules for how this happens. But it's going to be a utility, us, your ratepayers buying electricity, the utility taking in that utility and buying wholesale electricity, and then the developer paying the bankers who made it possible to build an expensive project. So there's not need for the state in there passing taxpayer money around. It could be done, but it's not needed anymore given the pricing. And so, for example, the way people are always thinking about offshore wind is we want to do a small project so it's not too many megawatt hours getting moved because that keeps raising the bill, the more megawatt hours. Well, it's now reversed. So larger projects cost the consumers less because you're reducing the cost of the project per megawatt hour, but you're also not increasing cost to consumers because the wholesale price is not any higher. So it's a kind of weird, strange, a little bit different way to think about all the policies and where the money flows and everything. But this is no longer something that has to be subsidized. And granted, I'm saying we do have a federal subsidy and there's all reasons for that. I'm just talking about the state here. So what is the process overall? We'll blow up part of this and look at it in a bit more detail. But there's, first a legislative discussion and administrative and legislative, but legislative discussion about, do we want to go ahead with this? Does it make sense? Can we do it in a way that results in a law that can govern this process? And then if that passes that threshold, then agencies develop and issue an RFP. Some agencies have to be enabled, presumably by the legislature. And then I'm reading on the left here. Then the agencies issue an RFP and receive bids and evaluate those bids. If that passes a couple of sieves there, then there's a contract between the winning bidder and the off-taker. The off-taker is the one who receives the electricity, takes the energy off the producers, the wind farms machines. So the contract between the winning bidder and the off-taker, that is the utility. And then you build the project. So that's kind of the overview on the left side there. Let's look at this in more detail starting at the top half. So the legislature is considering it. Energy committees decide whether to advance a bill. If they decide not to, the process stops there. Full legislature considers the bill, which defines minimum RFP requirements, evaluation criteria, for requirement for public hearings, agencies which are chosen to direct and implement the process. If that doesn't get decided or is not agreement, then the process stops there. If so, if it then the governor signs the bill. Hopefully, both houses pass it, and then agencies consult with off-takers, prepare and issue requests for qualified bidders, and obtain responses. So there's this qualification process first before you issue a request for bids. You get one or more qualified bidders who say, yeah, we intend to bid. And then the agencies say, well, okay, these people know how to do it and they can raise that sort of money and they're not going to just mess around and not get anything done. So they're qualified bidders. And then, the agencies consult again and prepare and issue an RFP consistent with the law. So legislature, presumably with input from the administration and so forth, but the legislature is saying, here's how we want you to do it. Here are the things that we think are important. We want to put more weight on, lowering the cost, or we want to put more weight on creating more jobs, whatever that is. That should then go into the RFP. So the bidders, the developers know what they need to do to prepare a bid and to win against the other bidders. Okay, so that's the top half. We're going to go on the right there down to the next box. Then that's a short arrow, but chaos at the developer's offices where everybody, including the custodian, is pulled in to get that bid together in time. And then they submit the proposals. And if there's less than 2 proposals, I think this is a recommendation. Agencies can do it how they want or how the legislature directs. But if there's less than 2 proposals, I think that they probably say, no, that's not competition. That's essential to us. And here's when we're going to have our next RFP time. Assuming there's 2 or more proposals, then the agencies go through and maybe rank the bids, or maybe they pick the winning bidder. That's a process to be determined, and in how this is all set up by the state. And then it is, after internal consultation, I would assume the winning bid is announced to the public. So at that point, there's a announced, provider of power, and then through, again, whatever the legislature has decided is going to be one utility or multiple utilities. There's contract negotiations between the winning bidders and the off-takers, that is the utilities. So that is a contract. So there's might be a winning bidder, and maybe they say we can't agree on a contract, and then the agencies or the state comes back in and says, well, you got to do this or that. But that may be a process. It has not been a problem, but it's usually been a bit of a drawn out negotiation to get to an actual contract. And I believe that would have to be approved by the PSC. So that would be one of the agencies involved here. So then at the bottom, agencies approve the final contract and any other agreed upon actions. There may be some actions that are agreed to that are not part of the power contract. And then it's up to the developer. They start active project development. They have to finalize the remaining permits. They have to get contracts with their suppliers. They have to have discussions with stakeholders. And then when that's all done and they get the permits, they close funding. That is somebody, or actually it's probably a group of lenders who sign checks. So in so many words, sign checks for a total of something like 2.5 to 3 billion. The developer starts buying parts, and there's a timeline on that that's important for the qualification of the federal tax credit. Then construction begins, and at some point the project is completed, power production begins, and since this group has environmental issues, an important part of that, the other subtext on that last thing is power production begins and fossil fuel power plants turn off, because you can't put too much power on the grid. You're going to have to turn off some existing thermal plants in order to accommodate new power coming in. And that's also going to be accommodate your contracts and so forth. So that's the overall process. So what does this look like on map and space? This is released by Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, I think three weeks ago about. So this is their current area of potential development of offshore wind. And just to, again, to give you the sort of scale, scope, if you can see that one area, there's two areas that are darker off Ocean City and Rehoboth, essentially. So those two areas total about that amount I said would be required to run Delaware, about 2.4 gigawatts. Now, most of that is going to Maryland, not to Delaware, contractually, although the power may flow through Delaware to be determined. But just kind of scope, those two areas, which are mostly used up already, are enough to run the whole state of Delaware's electricity. And look at the size of those in comparison to the area that's potentially up for auction. So this is what I mean when I say this is a large resource. Now, there's a lot of provisos. Not all of that will be turned into what's called wind energy areas that then developers can lease. Maybe half or 2/3, something like that, will actually turn into wind energy areas, unless there's some big problem that appears in one of them. And another point here that's interesting, this is the first time BOEM has done this. You can see the lighter blue is the continental shelf and the darker blue is the deep ocean. So in the areas that are aligned in red off the continental shelf, that's 1 to 2 kilometers of water. So it's a mile deep. So those are not going to be wind turbines on towers. Those will be floating wind turbines. And this is a really large area for floating wind, but it could be developed late in this decade or maybe early 2030s. And that's the kind of thing where you could say, well, do you want to make electricity out there in a floating device, or do you want to make hydrogen? Maybe you're making hydrogen and bringing that in by some mechanism. So that's very interesting, and that's going to be economic activity in our area that'll make, I think, the fuels industry and maybe the fertilizer industry look a bit different, or at least we'll have some options, some green options that they don't have today. So this is the ocean area. I know a few of you were in on the BOEM task force meeting and that discussed this, but this will be developed over the next year. I'm sorry, developed in that it'll be allocated into wind energy areas and then sold at a lease auction to developers. The one thing that's important about this is that we would like to see, that is the state of Delaware's interests, I believe, are the state's interests. We would like to see the northernmost area there near the current wind energy area for Delaware. We'd like to see that made into 2 or 3 wind energy areas that will actually be leased. Why do we care? Because if there are, say, 2, 3, 4 leases there and then going down further into the off Maryland area, that's more competition. If BOEM decided, no, we don't want to make any of those into wind energy areas, then we're looking at power sources that are much further away, adds to the cost of transmission, or we may have fewer bidders. So it's in Delaware's interest that BOEM proceed and turn those into wind energy areas, and we, the state, are in the task force and have the ability to voice that. Just a quick view of the schedule. This is trying to make a practical schedule. There's some things that are a little tight here, maybe too optimistic, but just to give you a sense of why it takes so long. We're in June. Maybe if there's a bill passed in June, it would have been easier if we'd been able to get this report out earlier. But if there's a bill passed in June and start the clock then, that BOEM lease sale would be Q2 of 2023. So that's when we'll know, who the possible bidders might be that are close by. You can't really issue an RFP until that because there's not enough supply. There's not enough potential bidders that are in the neighborhood. So that's why I put the Delaware agencies issue RFP right after that Central Atlantic wind energy area lease. So then, you have to give some time for the bidders to issue their proposals back in response to RFP. I got 1 quarter here. They'd probably like a little more time. And then the agencies select the following quarter and just start the process of negotiating a contract. At that point, the developer would presumably feel they're ready to start spending money. If you've just put in a bid and 2 or 3 or 4 others have, you may not want to start spending money on surveys and so forth. So that's all of this is timing of how things, you got to do them in order, or you're asking, and they'll refuse, to spend a bunch of money when they don't even know if they've got a contract or not. So after the announcement, you know who the bid winner is, but then you got to get a complete contract negotiation. We're figuring that's taking at least a quarter. Also, developer submits their construction and operation plan. Here, this is very aggressive, 1 year to get an approval of that. I think probably a number of people would say that's not realistic. It's going to take more than that. And that's why I've got uncertain timing in there. But the problem is we really have to have a qualification of the bidder and a BOEM approval to be able to get what's called safe harbor to qualify for this federal investment tax credit. That is a huge cost to Delaware ratepayers if we do not qualify for that. So that's put in there quarter 4 of 2025. That's federal law. It's 30% credit, and it goes away if you've missed that quarter. Now, it might get extended. Let's hope it does. That gives some more flexibility there. But we have to be aware of that deadline for risk minimization in doing this. Okay, at some point, the developer reaches financial close with their investors, and then construction can begin right after that. And it's a year and a half to build it. So you're actually running a commission and operation date, COD, quarter 4 of 27. So it seems like it takes forever. It doesn't take nearly that long to buy an electric car or put solar on my roof, but that's how long it takes, more or less. And the state can speed things up a bit. We can only do so much. Okay, so I'm not going to go into detail on these. Those are in the report. But state options to reduce cost include these here. One I already mentioned, that state urges BOEM to create more wind energy areas to lease near Delaware. Doesn't cost us anything. Very substantial savings to ratepayers if we're not trying to pay for long transmission lines, or if there's insufficient competition. It's only 1 or 2 bidders, because there were no WAs created out near us. We want to define rules for siting the transmission cable. That's probably the process that we have so far is long delay, which means the developer is going to put a risk premium in that, which means ratepayers pay for that. So more detail on that, but we need to have a little bit better defined rules for how the transmission cable gets sited coming ashore. There are 2 Maryland projects already that would like to connect at Indian River, which is in Sussex County, of course. That's the coal power plant there is shutting down. They've said the transmission will be available for other types of power generation. This is a good candidate. Does it make sense for 3 different projects, 2 Maryland projects already granted approval by the state of Maryland, plus maybe a Delaware project? Does it make sense for 3 different projects to have 3 different cables coming across the beach at 3 different points and then all running separately to Indian River? It certainly doesn't make sense financially, and it's more disruption to beach communities, more cost for the cables and all that. So there's a pretty strong argument for the state to help coordinate, maybe with the state of Maryland, electric transmission getting to Indian River as a common point. And then there would be some upgrades needed there to get from there to loads. But that's, again, a separate action by the state, which has substantial savings in cost to ratepayers ultimately. A lot of permits are by DNRECs, a lot are by the federal government, but we recommend that DNREC review and provide guidance on the regulatory process to developers. So it's not clear sometimes how the existing regulations would apply to an offshore wind project, because they've been written and designed, of course, for other types of activities which existed at the time the specific rules and processes and even the forms that you fill out were written. So that's like, it's a little bit of agency staff time and a pretty substantial savings again, because delays and risk are your real enemy here in terms of cost. State could install a meteorological buoy before a lot of these things happen. So that gives, can't really go into the detail of why that's valuable, but that also saves ratepayer time and reduces ratepayer cost and reduces schedule time. And then right sizing the project, we looked at 800 megawatts versus lower, gets really expensive, smaller that is. 1200 would be kind of the next increment up. They generally sort of go in 400 megawatt increments because the transformer sizes and line sizes, but can be other sizes. But so is 1200 right? Well, it's a little bit more difficult to do a 1200 megawatt project right now. So we have analysis of that. So we want to get the size of the project right. That's part of the whole process, getting up to the RFP. Do we want to say bid for 800? Or do we want to say bid for 800, but you can give us a bid for 1200 also, and we'll evaluate it. So that's an open question. There's also options to create employment. We started looking through these and the kind of general sense that I think state governments have, and I more or less thought this myself going into it, is that all of these things that create employment are going to cost extra. Either the state pays for something or the developer pays for something, which, hey, it's not free. That means the developer is adding it to the cost of energy, which means the ratepayers pay for it. So I thought more or less, there would be cost to each of these. A lot of them actually don't cost anything. It's sometimes just either state or private entities doing things, maybe in some of these cases, because Delaware has an offshore wind project going forward. Some of these definitely do have costs. Some of them are like weirdly cheap. Like one is a 60 cents per megawatt hour increase in costs. So that translates down to average consumer bill, 20% increase per month. That creates a huge number of jobs, So yeah, that's part of what we're trying to do here, is figure out what things cost. And I think in this we have some revealing results where some things are really a good deal, and a lot of things it doesn't actually cost anything. And then we have a section on sort of what businesses and industries could be created in the future if Delaware decides to participate in this market. So these are options for employment. Okay, we do a price comparison, and this is going to be qualitative here. We've been asked to not, since we haven't released the study that yet, we've been asked to not give the specifics on the dollars, but we can give a comparative and sort of qualitative comparison. Just to kind of introduce you, it's not like you're looking at two things in the store, and one costs $5 and the other costs $5.50. It's not so clear as that. You're really comparing apples and oranges here, or apples and basketballs maybe. When you're buying fossil fuel produced power, the contracts are very short. And why are the contracts short? Because the price of fossil fuel varies widely through time. So I just saw a report that next year, the price of electricity from new contracts, this is mostly from natural gas plants, is expected to go up by 20 to 30%. So that's a 1 year over the next change. And a few years later, it'll go down by just as much. So the cost of electricity in fossil fuel facilities is strongly determined by the cost of the fuel, the feedstock, the fuel, natural gas, coal, or whatever. So at a minimum, to understand what the cost of energy is now, we have to look at a range of years. We can't just look at 1 year. We can't look at this year. And like when you're looking across utilities, that gets complicated too. The co-op may have a lower wholesale purchase cost than other Delaware utilities. So that means that they're going to have different reactions. If we say, well, it's the same cost as existing power, that might not be true for the co-op. So then another one is kind of outside of market costs. How do you include health and environmental costs? Because those are real costs. People pay those and they suffer from health effects. And obviously, cost of climate change is starting to be very real in terms of budgets and lost houses and so forth. And as I mentioned already, there's a federal subsidy here. How do we include that? Well, generally we're mentioning it, but not including our logic, because that doesn't cost Delaware ratepayers anything, whether we take it or not. That's coming out of the federal budget. You can say, I don't like that, I don't like subsidies or whatever, or you can say that's reasonable because it's clean energy, there should be subsidies. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying as a Delaware decision, it doesn't make sense to include the federal subsidies because that doesn't affect our payments in any way. That's already assumed, and the developer will assume it in their cost analysis, and then we figure out what it's costing ratepayers and maybe the taxpayers if the taxpayers spend any on this. So that's one decision we've already made. So then for our analysis. Yeah, so we looked at a bunch of other projects and we just eliminated those that are below 800 megawatts. Those that are the earliest signed, the first projects done, those are just much more expensive. So we're really looking at a kind of 800 megawatt and larger projects to say, what is the cost of offshore wind? Also, a few states put in major employment investments of, 100 million plus on facilities, on more than one facility. So those are also not quite comparable unless Delaware decides to do that. I'm guessing they don't because of how much I heard concern about the cost of energy when we were talking about this, but we'll see. It's up to the state. I mentioned already the wind price is contracted. It can be the same for 20 years. A typical thing would be to set your price escalator to the inflation rate, which means you sign on year one. You've got a price you're paying on year one, and the amount it increases each year is equal to predicted inflation. Inflation may be more or less, but that means in what an economist would call real dollars, you pay the same amount for 20 years. There's no way you can get that deal with a fossil fuel generator. So that's kind of hard to compare also. We didn't really take consideration of that. That's an advantage of when we didn't put that in our cost comparison. And then how do we know? At 27 is when this would go online. 25 is when the developer costs are all fixed. So there's amount of guesswork on what that's going to be in the future. We can look at past prices, but the price is going down quickly. So that's not going to tell you what future price is going to be. And then last, there's external costs, as an economist would call it. There's a cost of CO2 and a cost for pollution. That's not in the market transaction. The market cost of energy doesn't include that, but it's huge. And there's federal numbers for this now. There's $40 per megawatt hour for CO2 and 41 for health damage. So to really say what are the cost comparisons, you would add those. And there's also a cost for wind. You have to make the steel, you have to run fossil fuel vessels out to install things, you're going out to maintain them. Those are fossil fuel uses too. So there's an environmental cost for that. So we added that in. We calculated. So the carbon cost here, you can see it's $40 per megawatt hour. So the carbon cost for offshore wind is 44 cents per megawatt hour. So it's 1/100th, but it's still there. We include it. So then let's just look qualitatively. We're not giving the numbers yet. Some things may shift, but this is comparing today's power price at the top. And let's just look at the first line there. Market Delmarva recent wholesale prices. Again, there may be a little bit different wholesale prices, especially for the co-op, but market price for Delmarva power is in that range because the last 6 years, it's been pretty different years. And let's just skip down to Massachusetts, which had a prioritizing low cost in the bidding. But this was bid, like 3 or 4 years ago. But you can see that range for their first 3 projects, I guess, that met our minimum criteria, at least 800 megawatts and so forth. All these Massachusetts projects were bid primarily on low price. You can see it's in the same range as Delmarva's wholesale price. Maryland, for example, a little bit higher. Their wind is not quite as strong as Massachusetts, and also there are substantial investments in plant. This is all normalized to 2021 dollars. So you can see we're in that range actually of what Delmarva is paying for wholesale power. Now, what is it going to be? But those are all past. They're all looking at the past here. So what is it if we have judgment, expert judgment of what the prices will be in 2025? Let's take the Maryland number. This is not an exact science, but Weiser et al. At Lawrence Berkeley Lab surveyed experts on offshore wind and said, how much lower will the cost be in 2025 compared to 2020? So if you adjust the Maryland projects by that range is what you see from this expert judgment. We've got two processes so far, looking at other contracts with an adjustment for the future. And then we also did a bottom-up analysis, which is the way a developer would do it. What do all the components cost? What is our cost of borrowing money? What is our risk? And what's our O&M going to be? What our maintenance costs over the time of the project? What are we going to do when the power purchase agreement runs out? Because there's usually some years at the end. These are 30-year projects. Generally, a power purchase agreement is for 20 years. That's up to the state again. We can say we want it longer or shorter. So what happens after that? So you take all of those and put them in a spreadsheet, which is set up to calculate the cost of electricity from offshore wind. And that's our number right there, which is, it's kind of in the midpoint of the Massachusetts and Maryland projects. You could say compared to the Weiser projection, it's maybe a little conservative. That is a little high. All of our reports previously, we've estimated a little bit higher cost than actually turned out to be the case when those states did build projects. So we can say, you might say that's higher, it's low or whatever, but that's our kind of bottom-up calculation. And then bottom-up meaning pieces up to a single price. And then we look at these options. So there's, here I have 7, I thought it was 6, but at any rate, we've got 7, I guess, options for the state to reduce price. So if the state does all of those and they're all successful, then it gets down to the leftmost price here, which you would see is actually below the lowest price Delmarva's paid for power over the last 6 years. Or it's even with it. I'm holding up a ruler to my screen. It's either even or lower than the lowest price Delmarva's. I don't know how many things the state will try to do and whether they'll be successful and whether our estimates of how much savings that there will be are exactly right. But that's why I say, when I say the bottom line is, it'll be either within the range of what we're paying for power now or below what we're paying for now. That's what I mean. There's all these uncertainties, different numbers to try and judge. You can't just say it's $5 versus $5.50, but it appears that it certainly would not be higher than what we're paying now, and it could well be lower than what we've paid over the last 6 years for wholesale power going into our largest state utility. Now, I mentioned this externalities, so let's go back up to the gray power. Choosing colors there, perhaps displaying a bit of bias, but if you include the health cost on top of the market cost, that's what the power that we're getting today costs, and it costs society. It's not in your electric bill, it's in your insurance payment, it's in your lost work time because of respiratory disease. It's because it's in the cost of health damage, and that's a pretty good number. It's got a big error bar on it, but it's not a made up number. It's not something artificial. It's not something that's not really there. So if you add health cost to the market cost, that's the range. And if you say, well, I don't believe in climate change, I'm not going to go with that carbon cost, but health is health. So I believe that, and we're not going to have a health cost. We're not going to sort of turn that into a policy of some tax on electricity, but let's consider this in making a decision about where we want our power to come from. If you say, I believe that's actually the cost of fossil fuel, including the health cost, then you can see all of these options for offshore wind are cheaper than anything in that range of the market cost of wholesale power and health costs as an externality. And if you have health cost plus carbon cost, it's wildly lower cost to go with wind. Now, that's not something the PUC will necessarily include in considering what's lower cost. But for us to think about it and decide what makes sense to do, and are we worried about the cost of wind being too high? That's a consideration in your logic, and some people would reject one and not the other of those external costs. But this is put out here for people to look at and decide. It turns out now we kind of don't even need to do that because offshore wind is getting cheap enough that it's really in the same range anyway, and it creates employment stuff. So if you don't care about health and you don't care about CO2, you might want to do this anyway. But this is the comparison overall. And if there are questions about specifics here, we can come back to them. So conclusion here, market price of electricity from offshore wind is within the range of current Delmarva purchases without any state subsidy. Market price is a bit misleading because climate plus health costs is an $80 per megawatt hour adder. You know, there's a 40, and by the way, on those wind bars, I already put in the 44 cents, plus I assumed it was the same for health. They don't have a good number on that. So the bars are slightly shifted because it rounded up to the next dollar. So the carbon cost is in there on the blue bars as well. But this market price is misleading. Nevertheless, offshore wind looks like it's at or below market cost. If you care about climate change, not everybody who does offshore wind or wants to do it does, but if you care about it, this can be installed in big chunks. An economically efficient project of 800 megawatts reduces roughly 30% of Delaware's power sector CO2 emissions in one step. And you can do more steps. So there's some complexities once you go beyond that we have described in the report, but you can definitely keep doing that. But you don't get the prices unless you have a well-structured procurement process. We've provided guidance on that. Some things that all the other states have done, or most of them, and then there's some choices about how we want to do it. And apart from making a good procurement process, the state has options to reduce the cost further, which, as I said, there's seven options. State can choose which ones to do, but those are getting the cost further down than what we've said above in the conclusions. There's also opportunities for adding employment. Most of those actually don't have a significant extra cost. Just doing a procurement advances a number of those possible employment benefits. So URL for some of the work that we do at the University of Delaware on wind power. Should have had the one for SIOW2, apologies. But if you look at SIOW University of Delaware, you'll get it. Also my Twitter account, sometimes I cover energy things on that. So open to go back to the moderator, and you can say if you want to have questions or how you want to do it. I thought I stopped sharing there.
You're on mute, Joe.
Thank you, Willett. That is a huge amount of information.
Sorry.
And I hope everybody took lots of notes and knows lots of stuff. That is absolutely fantastic. Can we just do questions from the floor without putting them in the chat? Would that be okay?
Yeah, Jill, I have a question.
Yeah, go.
We have family in Block Island, Rhode Island, which had one of the early maybe pilot runs of wind. And I know it's maybe 10 to 20 times smaller than what you're talking about here. But as the second smallest state in the nation now living here, I'm curious, did we learn anything from them? Was that helpful? Is there anything that we can learn from what they did that would help us to determine what to do right or not here?
Well, there's some things, but remember there's a huge industry in Europe, and there's becoming a huge energy off East Asia. So that's really where most of the learning is happening. There are some things that we learned from Block Island. So we learned that we can do that with some domestic supply chain. All the foundations were built in the US. They were shipped to the site in the US. We learned about kind of a use of installation vessels There were some really scary mistakes in installing the foundation in particular. That's not necessarily advertised when you see the material on the project. So it was good using U.S. supply chain, but U.S. supply chain is still learning. That wasn't in building the foundations, that was in installing them. You're moving a really big steel structure on a floating vessel, and things are moving. That is a formula for injuries. Nobody got injured, that didn't happen, but it was just, there were some mistakes there. So there was learning on that. And there have been biological surveys of the foundations. And there's it's sort of like our subway cars that we've got underwater here in the bay. It's a real habitat for fish. So there's been a big proliferation of different species in and around the towers, and it's really heavily used by anglers. So those are all things that we learned from Block Island. But in the meantime, we've learned a ton of stuff from developments in Europe on installation, turbine size, cost in relation to turbine size, and so forth.
Thank you.
Yep. Sally Butner, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thanks, Jill. Willett and maybe Senator Hansen, what do you think are the prospects for getting legislation that's needed by the end of this session?
I'm not going to comment on that.
I can't until I see the report. I need to see what the report says and then talk with my colleagues about it. And then it will come down to drafting, like, is this something that the department is going to be actively involved in drafting? Is it something that I'm just going to need to do with the help of Willett? There's some practical things but we go back in session in March. So we're going to need to have some legislation up and really going, I would say, at some point in April to get this moving along. So it really depends on what the report says. I'm hopeful, it sounds really good, and I'd like to see this work.
Thank you.
That would be wonderful. I think everybody on this call would be, willing to call. And I think Dee has asked people to raise their hands on the Q&A thing, and I will call on folks. So Amy Rowe, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Willett, for your wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you what steps should trigger public involvement in this? What should we be looking out for?
Well, I think you know more about public involvement than I do, but there will be a public release of the report, and that's we have an agreement with NREC, and they're going to hate me for saying this, but if we read the schedule in that agreement, it's like a couple of weeks after the final report is returned to them, that would be released. So that's going to be up to their schedule. There's not sort of a really tight date on that. And then, I think, again, I turn to your own organization, the League, the Sierra Club, as far as what's the right time of advocacy and what way to do advocacy. That's not my specialty. But I guess when you were asking about benchmarks, one benchmark would be release of the report so the information is available. Hopefully, our colleagues at the agency have been sharing it with a few legislators before that, so they don't getting it at the same time as the public. Again, I'm not controlling that process. Then, so there's public release, and then, as Senator Hansen said, she'd like to see a bill. We're getting it to her late, so we're not making it any easier. But there'll be some drafting process, and I guess there would be some time in there where public comment would be appropriate. And Senator Hansen's had a bunch of these public meetings, and it's really done energy legislation in a very public way. So it'll be up to her if she wants to follow the same kind of process in this case, but there may be a sort of marked point at which you see that the input is welcome. And you may also see people who are opposing this. So one thing I didn't mention about price, when a big bunch of new power comes on like this, it pushes the price down of existing power. So that's technically called price suppression, which is great for ratepayers, and it actually makes wind cheaper than what you would see on that graph, because some of the existing power goes out of business and more of it gets notched down in price. But of course, anybody whose ox is being gored is going to oppose this and say, oh, you should have a smaller wind project, or we shouldn't be doing offshore wind because it has all these bad effects. So when you see opposition coming out, that would be another kind of benchmark. And you see sort of public opposition with arguments of why this is a terrible idea. Maybe some of those are valid arguments of why there's problems, but that would be another benchmark that somebody else is commenting and trying to say, we don't want this to happen. So that would be another benchmark. I think when, even when the legislation is passed, if there is legislation, if it gets passed, that would be another point where then it goes to agencies who are implementing it. And, maybe there's an opportunity to comment. There will be public hearings. There'll probably be a bunch of public hearings. So involvement at that point. I think here, if you saw that map that I had from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the likely areas where a project that now that Delaware's back in the game of offshore wind, if we go forward, the close by areas are already used up for Maryland projects. So that's okay, it costs more for transmission, but wind got cheaper in the meantime. So we're probably not any worse off. But we're not going to see those. So all the stuff about seeing it from Rehoboth and all that is pretty much gone. You're looking at stuff nearly over the horizon, not quite. You'd see maybe the top over the horizon, but there's going to be a big Maryland wind farm between our beach communities and anything that gets built for us. So that doesn't mean people will be logical, but if they were logical, you'd kind of have eliminated all the site visual impact stuff because it's not really going to be visible. But there will be opposition. So, that would be a time, like I say, and there'll be hearings when it gets to cable landings. So those will be more concerned to the people in the area around the cable landing, but some of you live along the beach. So that would be important to turn out and to participate in that process. So I think that's kind of my off the cuff answer to your question, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Bucciani, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. A couple comments and then I'll ask my question with your permission. I'm actually going to loop back to Amy. I spent a lot of time on this off of Rehoboth, Bethany Beach, and so on. So we kind of glanced through that, but I do want to go back because we lived it. All right. Number one, I've spent a lot of time with the unions, IBEW. One of the questions was, how are they on all this? Well, they're actually for it. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. That's number one. Number two is in Salisbury, Maryland, there's a new company that's been formed called Archon, who actually is going to be doing the training and the repairing of these, which is coming online by American, a lot of jobs available, IBEW. So that's good. But let me get back to Bethany before my question. I attended town hall meetings. I own a media company. I'm working with Orsted and some of the others. And many of the people were progressive, sustainable energy, isn't this great, blah, blah, blah. So I went and I filmed the whole thing and got smacked with something I never expected from the progressive communities. We love this, but not in our backyard. And you mentioned, Willett, the cabling coming in, and that was one of the excuses, if you will, that was said, we can't do this. Now, the Indian River thing, actually is one solution where the cables will go in and the conversion from the coal. However, now the union's coming back in and saying, we have a lot of jobs at Indian River for coal, and they're going to be cut. We convert over to sustainable, and it's a lot less jobs. So you have the people push in arguments that are going on, moving ahead, slowing down, moving ahead, slowing down. Here's my question. Where are we at with the Rehoboth stuff in Bethany? Is that going to go ahead, or is it still stuck?
When you say Rehoboth stuff, you mean the line coming in from power, for power?
Right. Well, the whole project actually is on again, off again, slowed down. There's not my backyard opposition there still. What I'm asking is,
sorry,
is
let me
everything
interrupt
okay?
you.
Yeah.
So the project is not slowed down. They have to find a cable. If they can't find a cable, if they can't land the cable, they can't sell the power. So that could derail it. But the project is not off or on. That's been approved by the Maryland Public Service Commission. They've got a price, a contract, a delivery date, and so forth. Now they do need to have a cable landing, and
Right.
One of our recommendations is, rather than having each developer fighting it out on their own, there's some kind of coordinated transmission. Now, the developers may or may not like that, because the risk is that you've got somebody trying to coordinate transmission and they take an extra year to get it done. So you lose a year of electricity sales, which is a huge disaster financially. So developers, will have to see that they have assurances that that can be done in a way that does not lead to risk of delay. But what we will recommend in the report is a process that is not so scattered and all kinds of concerns that are really not health risks at all. A process which is a little bit better informed for making that decision. That's one thing. And then as a separate recommendation, and it's not even a recommendation, it's an option of doing a combined cable. So that means you're doing one set of permitting decisions, and you're also cutting a bunch of money off the cost of the cable. Now, you've raised a bunch of different things. The electricians at Indian River, that power plant, NRG has said they're closing it. So it's not a question of one or the other. It's whether there's going to be anything going on there at all. So that's not an either or. So I don't know, just kind of try to answer the questions there that were questions.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Can I just, one thing. So the power transmission lines, so however, let me re-ask the question. Could that scuttle the project if they can't figure that out?
You have to land a transmission line on land. And if you can't do that, you can't sell electricity. So that will definitely scuttle the project. But in the meantime, if it becomes 10 hearings at 2 or 3 different towns and no decision, that is really costly. And it may mean, and in fact, it already did mean, for the first Ursula project, they had to cancel the project. Now, that was not because of a confused public process, but rather they decided that their proposal was not consistent with their environmental policies because it was on an undisturbed wetland. But that kind of delay can mean that the project doesn't get done or gets combined with a later project or whatever. And that is an illustration of it. We've had a couple of other cases of that. And that's not free, that becomes a cost to the ratepayer. So it may be in that one, they've already given a bid and they decide not to do it. They can't really increase the price, but it means the next time there's a bid, there's going to be a big risk premium put in that cost. So it's in the interest of the state, it's in the interest of the ratepayers to figure out a way to not have that happen. You have to have plenty of public input. You got to make sure there's not environmental damage, or at least you're minimizing the environmental damage. You got to look at more than one option. There's got to be an informed process, but there shouldn't be a random process which generates unpredictable delays.
Lou, I
So we
see
don't
you,
know-
but let me jump to Mike Dunmeyer. I think you might have something to add here. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Mike Dunmire, I'm with US Wind, and for everyone's edification, we have the leasehold rights to the project that is principally off the coast of Ocean City. It comes as far north as the Fenwick Island latitudes, but it's principally along the coast of Ocean City. Ørsted, our competitor, has the lease area that's off the coast of Delaware. Just a couple points I want to make for folks as a follow-on to that last question. One is that the last OREC award from the Maryland PSC was in December. And of course, for competitive purposes, Ørsted and US Wind could not be talking during that time, but that time has passed. And we are now voluntarily coordinating and trying to figure out what we can do to lessen disturbances and work together on this. Now, having said that, framing what coordination can mean is a big picture concept that has a lot of different ways it can be interpreted. But the challenge, of course, that you need to understand is that each project will need to land multiple cables. One cable is able to bring forward about 400 megawatts worth of electricity. So, for the slightly over 2 gigawatts that are there, you're looking at about 6 cables overall. 3 between, 3 from US Wind, 3 from Ørsted. So, it's not a cable, but figuring out how we do this in a way that has the least impact to natural ecosystems and to human systems is something that both of us want to figure out.
Thank you, Mike. Lou Kilmer, go ahead. You've had your hand up,
Yes.
sorry, for a while.
No problem, no problem. Professor, I have a question. From previous meetings, we were told it cost about $1 million a mile for this cable to be installed and go on land. My question is, if most of the stuff is in the Maryland sector and most of the energy is going to Maryland, why do you come way up to the Indian River to go on land?
Because that's where the power connections are.
And there's no power connections in Maryland?
Not on the Eastern Shore. I mean, not if you want to run a gigawatt, if you've got a 100 megawatt project, maybe. But yeah, you can look at the maps, there are power flow maps and power, you can look at voltages, and, you need enough transmission capability to carry the power from the project to places that are using the electricity, so-called loads. Yeah. So
All right.
it's not random. It's not just sort of, that was a gigawatt of generation there, plus actually at Indian River. It's announced that it's shutting down. It's like a big, extension cord with nothing plugged into it.
Gotcha. I didn't understand that. I look from the economic point of view, but now you understood that the fact that this is the most economical place to connect on land. All right, makes sense. Thank you.
So there's actually a little bit an added. It's not quite what you were asking, but it sort of relates to what Mike Dunmeyer said also. So the other thing is, it's to the interest of Delaware to be in that discussion before the project is built, if we're going to go ahead with the project, because that extension cord, to use my analogy, is only so big. So if Ørsted and US Wind are like, okay, we need to get our projects connected, so we're going to make an extension cord this big and not any bigger, then Delaware comes in, a few years later and say, hey, we want to connect 800 megawatts ourselves now. Oh, you got to make your own, new extension cord. And by the way, where you're plugging into, that's not big enough either. So you're going to have to make all that bigger too. It's wildly cheaper to do that all at once.
Gotcha.
So
Makes sense.
we're looking at a proposal to do a planned, what are these two states going to do, and what makes sense in terms of design? And that means on the PJM side, they're the ones that are making the stuff bigger on the grid side. And then it would be the developers and state involvement on getting one or more cables. And when I say cable, I mean one set of cables in a trench, one or more cables going from the ocean to Indian River.
Yeah, Professor, my concern is that little Delaware isn't just, only a vehicle for bringing it online and not really benefiting from this wind energy?
Well, sure. So there's two parts to that. One is, do we want to build a project? You know, if we do, then it sort of changes what the next questions are. If we do want to build a project, then we're probably going to have to say, well, you know, we want you to plan ahead a little bit more than the developers would on their own, you know, because it's then extra considerations, maybe extra permitting, maybe extra costs. That doesn't mean the developers should bear that, but it's going to be a little bit more complicated if Delaware is included in planning for that transmission connection. So, but you know, right? I mean, that's the best connection. So, yeah, we can just sit around and not do anything, and that what you just said will happen. Little Delaware will get left out, and maybe we're not going to build a project, and then it's not an issue, you know. But if we are pretty sure, and I think the developers would rightly say, hey, you know, you guys don't have anything done here yet, so why should we allow for that in the future? But if we're pretty sure we're going to go ahead, then why should anybody listen to Delaware? It's because we've got the best extension cord.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other, I have a question to wrap up, but anybody else have a question that I'm not seeing? Going. I'm looking at your timeline for, you know, with the idea that legislation is passed before the end of this session. And you noted that, you know, delay and risk are what causes prices to go up. So is there any estimate if Delaware doesn't get this legislation passed? I mean, how, you know, if it goes into the next session, how bad is that?
I'm not going to venture a statement on that.
Okay.
It's really more, there's other things that are easier to identify, like if certain things are delayed in the middle of the process, we can identify what the cost of that is. It's harder to get things going if it's not done in this legislative session, but I couldn't give a cost on that. And you know, I have to take some responsibility. We thought we'd get this report out in November, and we were not able to do so. So that's something I'm not in any position to throw rocks at glass houses or whatever. So
No, I just
yeah.
in terms of you know, this is a bunch of advocates, and how can we be helpful in moving this along? And you know, if an increased cost down the line is a negative, then that is a positive for trying to have something done, you know, as quickly as possible. That was kind of how I was trying to shape that question.
Yeah, and so it kind of, it's not just generally delayed, but the reason, you know, it's valuable to have the legislation in this session is because it impacts these other deadlines. When the auction is for the water rights, that's set by the federal government. When the investment tax credit expires, that's set by the federal government. So that schedule you saw, we tried to sketch out what we would do to interface with those things which have you know, benefits to the state to be synchronized with those. So it's hard to answer that directly, and certainly I can't give any kind of cost number for it. I'm glad to stay a bit longer if you want to extend to more questions, but.
I think Ruth Ann, you have your hand up. Are you there, Ruth Ann?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I will have to look at the PowerPoint presentation. That was a lot of information. I'm curious.
Yeah, and I can provide that to Jill. So to answer
Okay, thank you. So there were requests.
I have a question because Dave Lawson, who represents our area, is saying that wind turbines are toxic in the process of making them, they pollute, and they are not recyclable. What's the plan? So he's claiming that anyone who pretends wind turbines are environmentally savvy are just uneducated. What do I say?
I have no idea what you say, but definitely pollution is created, and you know, like I said earlier, in making steel, you know, carrying things out to the ocean, installing them, Yeah, definitely pollution. But let's look at the quantity. So here's the matter where you don't have anything, no one is without sin, right? So how much pollution? So that's, I gave numbers for that. That was what I was talking about earlier. If you look at CO2 from fossil fuel per megawatt hour, it's about $41 of climate change effect, or 40, I guess it is. And that's a federal number. It's well vetted. It's being challenged, of course, but for a wind turbine, there's some very good studies. It's about 44 cents per megawatt hour. So it's a matter of 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times more. So yes, there's pollution, and when your representative has a way of producing power without making any pollution whatsoever, I'm going to vote for that as long as it's not too expensive. But right now we can reduce by literally and exactly quantitatively, we can reduce pollution by 99%. So why don't we go ahead and do that rather than waiting for the perfect source that has none whatsoever. Now, recyclability, you've got steel, you've got copper, you've got all kinds of metals which are easily recyclable. I believe what's being referred to there is the blades, which are composite materials with carbon fiber for extra strength near the base of the blades. So those have not had a good recycling method. And the wind turbine manufacturers, companies like GE, Vestas, Mitsubishi, they have realized that that's a weakness and have been working very hard on recycling. So there's some kinds of recycling that are really more environmentally helpful and some that are less, but kind of the worst case, you grind them up and put them in asphalt and you make the next road surface with them. But there's actually much more sophisticated recycling that's being developed now, costs more, but that would use it for other manufactured products, which take more advantage of the fiberglass. So yeah, it's correct that there's a very small environmental cost, not zero, and it's correct that one component of wind turbines has been hard to recycle, but now is being recycled. So then you can figure out how you respond to that.
Thank you so much.
Fred Hartman, you have your hand up?
Yeah. Early in your presentation, you talked about the household consumption of power. If we were to look at the whole picture, including the corporate buildings, including as we migrate with our vehicles from gas and diesel to electric, how much more load would that represent?
Well, so the overall load for the state of Delaware, including all of those uses, industrial, commercial buildings, residential, and our small fraction of electric cars that we have now, like I said, is 1.2 gigawatts, so 1,200 megawatts. That's on average, goes up and down from that. But you can compare that to an 800 megawatt wind farm, and half of that is kind of average power coming out. So that's why I use those numbers. So how much for electrification? Now, electric cars are a big chunk, and then you're going to have other electrification for heating eventually, but that's going to be coming later. So if you want to know about electric cars, it's adding somewhere around 30% to the load if you have all cars and light trucks electrified. So it's a noticeable increase, but not nearly doubling. So if you're adding 30%, then you're at something like 1.6 gigawatts instead of 1.2. So like I said, there's lots of ocean area out there. We're continuing to build solar. We're going to be doing community solar, I believe. So those are going to expand, but we've got this really big resource. If we need to, we expand those as well. I did not look at the expansion when I was just doing these rough numbers of how many projects you would need to electrify all of Delaware's electricity.
Great presentation. Every journey like this starts with the first step. So if we can get through legislation and get moving, that would be great. Oh, when will this report be published?
That's up to DENREC, but they have said that it would be, a few weeks, half a month, roughly, after I get the final one in, which should be by the end of this week. they've had the, first version to comment on for the last 2 weeks.
Fabulous. Keeping our fingers crossed. Sharon, did you have a question?
I do. I think we're all extremely familiar with the not in my backyard syndrome. Is there a perfect, for this process to actually happen, is there a perfect spot that we have in Delaware to lay these cables that are going to have to go to our land?
Well,
That is good for the energy and not for the people, but good for the energy?
Well, so what would you consider a perfect spot?
I'm asking, I mean, for the technology, what would be the perfect spot?
Well, Erstil's proposal, which had a lot of, comments and concerns and worries about it, was to use a kind of like a plow. It's called a jet plow, and they drag along the ocean bottom, and they move material out about 1 yard or 2 width, and then lay the cable in, and then there's a plow that closes over it. So the environmental impact of that is very small, although you would kill some benthic organisms in the process. When they get near the beach, they were going to do directional drilling about 20 feet under the beach. So that would be no disturbance of the beach and the immediate coastal zone, the tidal zone whatsoever. They had to dig up to, run the cable along roads to get to the point of connection on land. I would consider that to be an extremely small environmental impact, both of those. Kind of compare that with something like a dragging fishery, which is thousands of times more environmental impact on benthic organisms. And that's done every couple of years. So, I mean, literally thousands of times more environmental impact. So I would say that whole method has extremely small environmental impact. The concern, I think, was voiced because, maybe the developers could have done a better job, but there are also some people who were spreading, things that were not factual about the effect of this and the kind of dangers of electromagnetic radiation and things like that. So I don't think that it's a lack of a perfect place. I think there are many good places. I think it's a process where there were public hearings without, sort of the input that you need of factual information from third parties. People are going to not believe the developer. They're going to say the developer's just, in it for the profit, and there's some greedy foreign company that's making money off of us or whatever. So I think you need either the state or some other third party involved in that process, helping to make a decision that makes sense to everybody. Because it doesn't really make sense to have fear, which is maybe not even based on facts, raise the cost for everybody in the whole state and maybe prevent something from happening that prevents us from doing a climate solution. So I don't think it's a perfect spot. I think it's an imperfect process.
I'm sorry, I was not clear. And I wasn't trying to blame the developers here. I was trying to just try to figure out if there's is Greenville the perfect place to pipe this into, or or is Southbridge the perfect place to pipe it into? I mean,
the problem is getting the electricity. The problem is getting
that
the
our
electricity.
dilemma?
It's for getting electricity from the ocean into where there's wires connected, right? High voltage wires. So it's going to be a beach community.
Okay.
And can I
So
just
you can pick among those, yeah. Sorry.
Just when they were the Fenwick Island thing, there were huge benefits that were, I guess it was Orsted was gonna, give to the state as far as, and folks didn't want that, but expanding that park and expanding the parking. So there was a direct benefit. So, I have a place at Dewey Beach. I would invite them to come in at Dewey Beach and spend all that money there. Ruth Ann, you had a comment wherever you went here. You put it on the chat. You want to say it out loud?
Okay, I was just wondering what we've learned from 2008 with Blue Water Wind that might inform how we move forward. Did we learn anything from those days?
Well, there's a few veterans of Blue Water Wind on the line, and really appreciated working with all of you folks at that time. There's been so much that's happened since then. It's really kind of, the lessons are really more recent. You know, it's like, how is New York doing 9 gigawatts, and how is Massachusetts doing whatever it is now? I can't even keep up, 4.5 gigawatts or whatever. Those really have more lessons. And how have the turbine manufacturers gone from the 3 megawatt machines that Blue Water would have installed to the 12 to 15 megawatt machines that are now being installed at much lower cost. So those are really more where the lessons are, I think. But if you want to kind of feel like there was some interesting residual benefit from Blue Water Wind, which Delaware, of course, approved that project, go to an offshore wind conference. You'll see a lot of the management of the companies were people who were, interns at Blue Water Wind back in that time. They have kind of they got the bug, and they mostly, not all, have continued to work in the area. One of them, for example, is CEO of Vineyard Wind, which is the big, project, the first large project approved. So their people are out there. I'm not sure if we're drawing lessons right now from them.
Thank you. Sherry Evans Stanton, did I see your hand up floating around somewhere?
Yeah. So
Thank
a
you.
lot of people have raised issues about, misinformation out there, and I see a lot of experts on this event, as well as different organizations represented. And I think it's going to be incumbent on us to do what we've done successfully before, which is, to put out factual information and try and address any misconceptions before they can spread too far. I'm with the Sierra Club. Certainly we would be doing it. I know I see CCL and the League and a number of other folks on here as well. So we've done it before, so I'm confident we can do it again.
Thank you, Sherry.
Sherry, that's a really great point. The University of Delaware has also done a fact sheet that's kind of addressed a bunch of, so that would be great. And we can sometimes do that sort of thing, but we do have at least some material to draw on. And then of course you draw on many other sources for that. But that's a great role for environmental groups. And I appreciate your saying that Sierra Club would be willing to help with that.
Thank you. Phil, did you have a question? Phil Gross.
Yep. Good evening, Jill.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. I just wanted to ask, the composite blades, according to the manufacturers, GE or whoever else is making them, obviously they're going to be used as often as it spins, but can they be reused in their present form, or do they fatigue before the rest of the turbine and everything needs to be replaced?
Under normal conditions, the blades last the life of the machine, but they, as you say, under fatigue conditions with really gusty winds, they may become cracked and then have to be replaced. So there are sometimes blade replacements during the life of a wind turbine, and now offshore wind, we're talking about 30-year life here. So it's a long-lived machine. But when they're taken off, they can't be reused because they're tiny cracks. Fatigue cracks mean less strength, and you're not going to put that on another wind turbine. So that's what I was talking about before with the recycling. They can be ground up. The material can be used as various types of fill, but there's also people working right now on decomposing the blades and then reusing it in a more higher value way. I think that also probably touches on what kind of glues and resins are used in the manufacturing of the blades to make them more recyclable. That's a current area of research. So, I'd say if you try to take a blade off any kind of wind turbine today, chances are it would not be easy to recycle, but there are recycling processes. And the most important thing, manufacturers of those are committed to making their blades recyclable.
And I guess the other question is, you said roughly a 3-foot path of getting the cabling to the area where you would direct drill under the
Beach.
Can all the turbines be connected out at sea and then one major cable run in, or do you run a 3-foot by 50-mile trench that you dig, then cover up, as you said? Because, if you say, well, 3 feet, well, 3-foot by 3-foot space won't do damage to anything. But when you're talking about 3 foot times 50 turbines at a 50-mile, 40-mile distance, you're talking about, you're going to have to run into something that should not be disturbed in our ecosystem.
Yeah, right. So I probably was a little bit too off the cuff with 3 feet. It might be more like 6. And as I think it was Mike mentioned, there may be multiple cables. So yeah, it may be more than one trench. It probably will be. But there's 2 things that you can do. The most common thing which wind developers do today in the US is you do not run 50 cables in. Definitely, no way is that going to happen. Block Island actually runs a cable from each wind turbine, but there's only 6 wind turbines. So you would have a transformer or a substation offshore. It's mounted, on supports over the water, and you run in the cables from each string of turbines. So you're not even there running from each turbine individually. You have strings of turbines that go into that transformer station, and then they are collected electrically and stepped up to higher voltage. And then it's a 1 or 2 or 3 cables that come in as separate AC cables. So you might have in the range of 2, 6, 8 maybe, but never would you have 50 cables going in. The other way to do it we haven't seen yet in the US. I think we will be seeing this. There's proposals already for a transmission in New Jersey using direct current. So in direct current, you have 2 cables for as much as 3 gigawatts. So again, just Delaware as a benchmark, with 2 cables, you could run the whole state of Delaware. You might not want to for reliability. There's lots of provisos and so forth, but you have fewer cables when you have DC, but the stations on each end cost more. It's a complicated engineering economic choice to decide when you have enough power to be worth using DC rather than AC. But those are all options. But we're talking about between 2 and 12 or so cables. We're not talking about 50 cables.
And
Mike, did you have your hand up?
sorry, Jill.
No, I'm sorry. Did you have more questions? Sometimes Mike Dunmar has a comment.
Yeah, just,
I'd raise just in case, but Willett covered everything I would have mentioned.
just going along with that, if you have 3, 6, 8 cables come in, can the AC cables be trenched out together so you only have one disruption of the organism life, as you put it, coming in?
So, well, yeah, there you're getting a little bit beyond my knowledge in terms of proximity of cables and stuff like that. So I'm not going to give a comment on that. That's all very well understood. Nobody's going to kind of get that wrong or anything. But, of course, I don't want to disturb benthic creatures, but really, I'm not sure we want to give too much weight to that. You're talking about something like 6 feet, of disturbance. And every year, the clam and scallop and those guys, they're going through destroying huge areas. And half of what they get is bycatch, literally half. So half of the critters that they pull up, they throw overboard. Now, I'm not demeaning fishermen. I eat seafood all the time that's fresh caught. but it's like, you're worrying about one little tiny thing, in relation to, in the same area, something that's 1,000 times larger damage. It doesn't mean we don't want to take care of the small damage, but power cables are expensive. So we'll have to look at the trade-off between a very small environmental improvement of doing, 4 versus 6 trenches in comparison to knocking 1/3 of Delaware's electricity off carbon. So let's do it in the most environmentally benign way, but don't spend a lot of time worrying about whether it's 2 or 4 trenches. That's not a big environmental impact in the scale of all the things that we're doing here.
Willett, you are just every question. Can we have just one more question and then we'll call it a wrap, as they say? Because you've thank you so much for your extra time. This is wonderful. We just have, I guess, Leslie is the last question, and then we will say good night. Leslie, go ahead.
Thank you. So I know this is more technical side of things, but I'm just curious about the siting, and maybe that comes farther down the pike. But in terms of marine mammals and, creatures that are out there in the sea and migrate and, habitate out there, how does that work with the siting? That I know that sometimes could be an issue.
Yeah, so in terms of siting the wind project now, we're not talking about cables anymore, we're talking about the wind project itself. The big environmental damage, and again, it's big in terms of a couple of percent or whatever, but still the big thing is pile driving impact, which affects the hearing of submarine mammals, in particular right whales, which have been whaled, by the early whalers here. And they're not recovered fully. And so that sound, you have to manage that. You either don't use a process of pile driving, because there's ways to put turbines in the ocean floor without pile driving. That's not really widely accepted yet by the US industry. Or you control the sound either by spotting for whales, you have pay whale spotters, and you stop pile driving while whales are going by. That may be the best method. Of course, you've got a ship now that costs $500,000 a day, and the crew. So the developer and the installer does not like waiting a day for the right whales to go by, but they have to, because that's a requirement of the project. So that's something you would work out and you can do when you do the EIS. You also are going to have bird impacts. So most birds fly above where the turbines are, but there are some birds, and actually we've discovered recently some bats, which get out that far. And so there will be some avian collisions on the wind turbines. So those are the kind of main environmental impacts. Now, fishermen believe that these will affect their fishing grounds, and to be determined, but I haven't seen any good evidence that they do, other than you have to maneuver around a tower that didn't used to be there before. You used to have this ocean all to yourself. Maybe there'll be something proven in the future of how it really negatively affects fishing. At a minimum, during construction, you can't go through and fish. So there's got to be compensation. Developers have to pay compensation to fishermen for time they're not allowed to fish in that area. But those are the main things that come up. And these are, of course, regulated by the EIS you have to do. This is not something where, we have to count on us here on the line to remind the developers about right whales. That's all going to be very thoroughly studied as part of their EIS, and they will have to have a compliance plan that meets the requirements of NIMPS and the other federal agencies that will review this. But those are the main environmental impacts, to answer your question.
Okay. And was that part of your process with the
Not at all.
timeline?
We've got 2 sentences that say, we're not going to answer all these questions, including, impact on other species, because those are already covered by regulatory processes and elsewhere. And we already had almost 50 pages, which is too long. So no, we didn't try to cover that. We're deliberately not covering it. And I feel personally that it's very well covered already, but that's a whole nother process. There's different stakeholder hearings. There's an opportunity to comment. you know, that'll happen independently. We're just dealing with a procurement for offshore wind by state.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Willett, thank you. This has been more than wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time and your wisdom. And I am so happy that Delaware and the University of Delaware has you and your group. And if I can speak for everybody on this call, if we can all work together and we can get offshore wind rolling here, that will make me very happy. And I look forward to sitting on the beach and watching those beautiful turbines turn. And then I won't have to drive by Delaware City and see the refinery there.
Yeah.
Talk about
Well,
ugly. So
thank you, Jill, but you probably won't be able to see our turbines because it could be too far out, but.
on my binoculars. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys are wonderful.
Thanks to everybody. Appreciate the interest. My
Thank you,
co-author
Willett.
is on the
You are
line here.
fabulous.
She's disappeared, but Lily Peterson, wave a hand at a she's a co-author on this report. I didn't see anybody
Oh, Lily
else.
Peterson, thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah.